Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Today we're reading Canto 4, Chapter 9, verses 29 through 31. So this is the very end of the story of Dhruva Maharaj, and we are seeing the end result of after all the prayers and benedictions. Here, this is kind of the concluding verses. So, translation of verse 29. Maitreya answered, Dhruva Maharaj's heart, which was pierced by the arrows of the harsh words of his stepmother, was greatly aggrieved. And thus, when he fixed upon his goal of life, he did not forget her misbehavior. He did not demand actual liberation from this material world, but at the end of his devotional service, when the Supreme Personality of Godhead appeared before him, he was simply ashamed of the material demands he had in his mind. Verse 30. Dhruva Maharaj thought to himself, to endeavor to be situated in the shade of the lotus feet of the Lord is not an ordinary task, because even the great brahmacharis headed by Sanandana, who practiced Ashtanga Yoga in trance, attained the shelter of the Lord's lotus feet only after many, many births. Within 6 months, I achieved the same result, yet due to my thinking differently from the Lord, I fell down from my position. Verse 31. Alas, just look at me. I am so unfortunate. I approached the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who can immediately cut the chain of the repetition of birth and death. But still, out of my foolishness, I prayed for things which are perishable. I will be focusing on verse 29. And because it's a very long purport, I'm going to read 2 larger sections of this purport. So again, here's the translation. Maitreya answered, Dhruva Maharaj's heart, which was pierced by the arrows of the harsh words of his stepmother, was greatly aggrieved. And thus, when he fixed upon his goal of life, he did not forget her misbehavior. He did not demand actual liberation from this material world, but at the end of his devotional service, when the Supreme Personality of Godhead appeared before him, he was simply ashamed of the material demands he had in his mind. Purport. This important verse has been discussed by many stalwart commentators. Why was Dhruva Maharaj not very pleased, even after achieving the goal of life he desired? A pure devotee is always free from any kind of material desires. In the material world, one's material desires are almost demonic. One thinks of others as one's enemies. One thinks of revenge against one's enemies. One aspires to become the topmost person in this material world, and thus one competes with all others. This has been described in the Bhagavad Gita, 16th chapter, as asuric. A pure devotee has no demand from the Lord. His only concern is to serve the Lord sincerely and seriously, and he is not at all concerned about what will happen in the future. In the Mukunda Mala Stotra, King Kulashekara, author of the book, states in his prayer, My dear Lord, I don't want any position of sense gratification within this material world. I simply want to engage in your service perpetually. Similarly, Lord Chaitanya in his Shikshastika also prayed, My Lord, I do not want any amount of material wealth. I do not want any number of materialistic followers, nor do I want any attractive wife to enjoy. The only thing I want is that I may engage life after life in your service. Lord Chaitanya did not pray even for mukti or liberation. In this verse, Maitreya replied to Vidura that Dhruva Maharaj, influenced by a revengeful attitude towards his insulting stepmother, did not think of mukti, nor did he know what mukti was. Therefore, he failed to aim for mukti as his goal in life. But a pure devotee also does not want liberation. He is a soul completely surrendered to the Supreme Lord, and he does not demand anything from the Lord. This position was realized by Dhruva Maharaj when he saw the Supreme Personality of Godhead present personally before him, because he was elevated to the Vasudeva platform. The Vasudeva platform refers to the stage at which material contamination is conspicuous by absence only, or in other words, where there is no question of the material modes of nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. And one can therefore see the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because of the Vasudeva platform, one can see God face to face. The Lord is also called Vasudeva. Dhruva Maharaj's demand was for a position so exalted that it was never enjoyed even by Lord Brahma, his great-grandfather. Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is so affectionate and kind towards his devotee, especially to a devotee like Dhruva Maharaj, who went to render devotional service in the forest alone at the age of only 5 years, that although the motive might be impure, the Lord does not consider the motive. He is concerned with the service. But if a devotee has a particular motive, the Lord directly or indirectly knows it, and therefore he does not leave the devotee's material desires unfulfilled. These are some of the special favors by the Lord to a devotee. I'm going to skip through some of these other paragraphs where Srila Prabhupada talks about the kinds of mukti, and that the ultimate goal of mukti is bhakti, is devotion. So Srila Prabhupada says, sense gratification means domination over material nature. The whole competition between conditioned souls is based upon domination of this material nature. Modern scientists are proud of their knowledge because they are discovering new methods to dominate the laws of material nature. They think that this is the advancement of human civilization. The more they can dominate the material laws, the more advanced they are. Dhruva Maharaj's propensity in the beginning was like that. He wanted to dominate this material world in a greater position than Lord Brahma. Therefore, elsewhere, it is described that after the appearance of the Lord, when Dhruva Maharaj thought and compared his determination to his final reward, he realized that he had wanted a few particles of broken glass, but instead had received many diamonds. As soon as he saw the Supreme Personality of Godhead face to face, he immediately became conscious of the unimportance of his demands from the Lord to have an exalted position better than Lord Brahma's. When Dhruva Maharaj became situated on the Vasudeva platform due to seeing the Lord face to face, all his material contamination was cleared. Thus, he became ashamed of what his demands were and what he had achieved. He was very much ashamed to think that although he had gone to Madhuvan, giving up the kingdom of his father, and he had gotten a spiritual master like Narada Muni, he was thinking of revenge against his stepmother and wanted to occupy an exalted post within this material world. These were the causes for his moroseness, even after he received all the desired benedictions from the Lord. When Dhruva Maharaj factually saw the Supreme Personality of Godhead, there was no question of a revengeful attitude towards his stepmother, nor any aspiration to lord it over the material world. But the Supreme Personality is so kind that he knew that Dhruva Maharaj wanted these. Speaking before Dhruva Maharaj, he used the word Vedaham, because when Dhruva Maharaj demanded material benefits, the Lord was present within his heart and so knew everything. The Lord always knows everything a man is thinking. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, Vedaham Samatitani. The Lord fulfilled all Dhruva Maharaj's desires. His revengeful attitude towards his stepmother and stepbrother was satisfied. His desire for a more exalted position than that of his great-grandfather was also fulfilled. And at the same time, his eternal position in Dhruvaloka was fixed. Although Dhruva Maharaj's achievement of an eternal planet was not conceived of by him, Krishna thought, what will Dhruva do with an exalted position within this material world? Therefore, he gave Dhruva the opportunity to rule this material world for 36,000 years with unchangeable senses and the chance to perform many great sacrifices and thus become the most reputed king in this material world. And after finishing with all this material enjoyment, Dhruva would be promoted to the spiritual world, which includes the Dhruvaloka. Om Jnanitamirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, it's a beautiful verse and incredible purport. Really, really beautiful. And Prabhupada gives credit here by saying that many stalwart commentators have commented on this famous verse. And I was wondering, why is this verse famous? Like, just deducing my own reflections, why would it be considered famous? And I was thinking it's the culmination of the story of Dhruva Maharaj. So after all of this drama of being in the kingdom and being rejected by his father and insulted by his stepmother, going into the forest, doing austerities, and then encountering the Lord, and then offering his prayers, and then receiving the benediction of the Lord. We're all wondering, we're at the edges of our seats, right? Last week, I think someone was giving the talk, and then we're like, okay, what happens next? It's like the cliffhanger. How is Dhruva Maharaj going to respond to these benedictions that the Lord has offered to him? So we're wondering, this is the culmination of the entire story. What is he feeling? How is he going to receive these benedictions? We're looking to him. And that's why it's this attention is placed on Dhruva Maharaj's reaction. How does he receive all of this? So we're watching. And what do we see? What we see in this verse is that he's just not satisfied with this material opulence. He's not satisfied with what he thought would bring him satisfaction. And at the core, that's something that all human beings can relate with. I have this desire, I pursued it, and at the end, I'm not satisfied with it. What's really beautiful, I was reflecting about Srila Prabhupada's way of commentating, because his Bhagavad Gita has the Bhagavad Gita as it is, and that is to strongly state to any person who reads the Gita that Prabhupada is commenting on what the Gita is meant to say. There's meant to be a transformative power in the Gita. It's not just supposed to be a scholarly work. And how Prabhupada goes through each of those verses is so systematic. You can really see he's very loyal and faithful to the verse and the meaning that is behind the verse. So it's like also Srimad Bhagavatam as it is. Prabhupada always just goes through very systematically the verse and what is being said in every single verse as he goes. So for this verse, basically, he's systematically going through the fact that Dhruva Maharaj is aggrieved, the finer points of what is liberation, and the fact that Dhruva Maharaj wasn't aiming for it, and then Dhruva being ashamed of his motivations in his heart. So I want to start with kind of this, with Dhruva Maharaj being aggrieved, and I kind of want to follow in Prabhupada's footsteps a little bit here. And there was a particular section that resonated for me in the very beginning, where Prabhupada describes how in the material world, one's material desires are almost demonic. And I was sensing that the English is all mostly demonic, that when we're here in this material world, we usually have that tendency. So he says here, one thinks of others as one's enemies, one thinks of revenge against one's enemies, and one aspires to become the topmost leader or topmost person in this material world. And thus one competes with all others. And he even says, this has been described in the Bhagavad Gita, 16th chapter, as asuric. These are exactly Dhruva Maharaj's mood, you could say. Like, this is how he approaches the Lord. He thinks of others as one's enemies. His stepmother is his enemy. I don't think it's particularly stated that he thinks of his stepbrother as his enemy, but mainly his stepmother. He thinks of revenge. He's thinking of revenge against his stepmother, and he wants to become the topmost leader, topmost person in the world. He wants a kingdom greater than his father and his grandfather. His grandfather is Lord Brahma. So this is exactly Dhruva Maharaj. And Prabhupada says here, this is almost demonic. And according to the Bhagavad Gita, that kind of attitude is asuric. So you could say, what makes him not a demon? He had these motivations. I mean, in fact, one of the most famous demons, Hiranyakashipu, had these same tendencies also. And I spoke about it in a previous class, previous talk that I gave, that there's quite a few similarities between Dhruva Maharaj and Hiranyakashipu. And they both did tremendous austerity that even put the world in distress. So we have to consider what makes Dhruva Maharaj different. And again, I had mentioned in a previous talk how the power of association. So there was just a tiny smidgen and a drop of humility to listen, to receive instruction from his mother and Narada Muni. And by receiving the instruction, especially of Narada Muni, his spiritual master, it made his activities devotional service, even though his motives were impure. So Hiranyakashipu, he never received guidance from anyone. It was only himself. And that austerity in the mode of passion is to get something out of this. And they were both performing austerity in that mode of passion, but because he had some guidance by a pure devotee, it was mixed in.
So let's see. I was talking about how Prabhupada comments here how the motive might be impure, but the Lord does not consider the motive. He is concerned with the service. But if a devotee has a particular motive, the Lord directly or indirectly knows it. So I thought that this was maybe a little bit controversial because, don't we emphasize the mood, the attitude of service? Like, how am I serving? But I was reflecting how there's power in the ritual itself. So as long as the ritual or austerity does not harm oneself or others, because doing austerity that causes violence to oneself or others is austerity in the mode of ignorance. So austerity in the mode of passion, where at least you just have some gain that you want out of doing that austerity, that's frankly, most of the world is in that mode. I'm going to go to school, do austerity because I want a degree to make more money. I'm going to go on this particular diet so I can lose weight and be more beautiful. It's just usually that's the mode that the world is in for doing austerity. But if we just following some kind of ritual, especially if it has its roots in spiritual ritual, it has a power to propel us forward. And I was speaking about this with Ganesham, and he was giving me this term anda parampara, or blind parampara. That means this kind of blind following, and you don't know why or who you're following, you're just following. And but the power in this kind of following is that the ritual is there. So the service is there, right? Regardless of your mood or your motive, the service is still there. So, and someone at any point could ask, why? Like, why am I doing this? And they could immediately access the deeper meaning of that service and that ritual. So, but if you lose the ritual, it's gone forever. It's forever gone, that link. And there's even reason to ask why. So you can see how in India, there's a tradition of ritual and maybe even empty ritual, right? And maybe even criticizing, Indians who just kind of do things out of ritual. And I remember I was attending a Garba dance once. So this Garba during Durga Puja and these 9 nights, Navaratri of dancing for 9 nights. And you have usually a murti, or a statue of Durga, in the center, and everybody is dancing around Durga. It's a very ancient, beautiful, lovely tradition and ritual and dance. And kind of like intermission halfway through, there's a puja, and they actually have the plates with the different items of worship on it. So the lamps and the incense, and everybody stands around in this gigantic circle and sings and offers this puja to Durga. And so I think one time many years ago, I approached an elderly woman and I asked her, what is the purpose of this? Like, what's your meaning behind doing this puja, behind all of this? And she responded something very vague. I honestly don't even remember what she said. And I just had the impression like she had no idea why, why she was doing this. And she had been probably doing this her entire life, and she had no idea. So you could criticize that and say, hey, you don't know what you're doing. Why are you doing this? Right? This is andha parampara, this blind kind of following. But when we see, though, when someone comes along with any kind of purity and can ignite a question for someone to ask, why do we do this? It's like dry wood, and it just catches fire. That wood can catch fire. And not only, like I was thinking in Indian families, not only one person becomes a devotee, often like multiple family members, sometimes the entire family, sometimes like an entire dynasty, they just all become devotees. They all like receive initiation from a spiritual master, and they all immediately take up certain practices, and they're like, yes, this is, I'm going to start chanting. I'm going to start being aware of my diet and taking out onions and garlic and mushrooms, things like that. Because there's a power and the piety in just engaging in the service itself. And same with Jewish people, often they're criticized for ritual that seems empty or disconnected. But I mean, you see most of the leaders of the Hare Krishna movement come from Jewish backgrounds. There's a power and there's a Shakti in just doing the ritual. And I've been rereading Vanity Karma, written by Jayadvaita Swami. And in his introduction, he talks about, he's not even an Orthodox Jew. He doesn't come from that background. You might think, oh, the Jewish people who have their strong ritual. I mean, he just comes from almost secular Jewish background. But because they value going to study the Bible on Sunday, he went to, quote, he was saying you can't call it Sunday school because that's what Christians do. They go to Sunday school, but basically it's Sunday school. And he was going as a young teenager, 13, 14 years old, and they're studying the Bible. And by studying the Bible, most students there weren't that interested, but he was interested, and they were studying the Ecclesiastes. And that's where like so much like insight and inspiration came from. And his whole book, Vanity Karma, is on the Ecclesiastes. Is based on the Ecclesiastes. And that was from when he was 13, 14 years old. So that you could say that ritual of just studying this or meeting together or it's empty and there's no point to it. But if there's a connection to a spiritual tradition, there's power in it, and there's power to be transformative, So what Prabhupada is emphasizing here, and the Lord is also saying that the Lord doesn't look at your motive, he looks at your service. So that is a little bit of a plug to just do it, like just do the service. And even if the ritual seems empty, we can trust that if it's connected to some greater tradition, it can actually transform us and lead us to the Lord. So, the Lord knows our hearts, that if we stay with that tradition, it can actually awaken and transform our hearts to something greater than ourselves. And I want to mention one last thing. I know that we're running short on time just because of different delays. And I wanted to just briefly mention here how I was listening to a class by Radha Swami that he gave on this verse. And it was a very powerful point that he made, which is that, when someone is given material opulences, that person doesn't have spiritual potency, then they have potential to really become corrupt and destructive. And so, initially Dhruva Maharaj's motivations were demonic. according to Bhagavad Gita, and even that definition of a demonic kind of motivation, revenge, wanting to lord it over. He was revengeful and bitter, right? So, if he had been granted his material desires in that mood, he potentially could have become very destructive, just like Hiranyakashipu. But by the association of Narada Muni and consequently performing this devotional service under that direction, he became purified. And then by that purification, Lord felt, okay, this person is qualified to lead the world for 36,000 years. He can handle the pressure of that opulence. And even Prabhupada says here, Krishna thought, what will Dhruva do with an exalted position within this material world? So Krishna gave him that opportunity because he said he'll perform great sacrifices and he'll become reputed and he'll actually purify the whole world because his character is pure. And, Ranaswami gives this beautiful example of correlation with Srila Prabhupada, whether he was penniless and he had nothing in New York City, or he was riding a cargo ship. And he was saying, even the poorest people in India, if nowadays they want to get to America, even they will be riding a 747 airliner, right? So whether Prabhupada, when he first came, was on a cargo ship, or he was riding some jet and picked up in Cadillacs and Mercedes and BMWs, and he had the most opulent kind of service, he stayed and remained the same. All of that opulence with all of these followers and wealth, it never corrupted Srila Prabhupada. He just stayed focused on his service, and he stayed loyal to all of his principles and to his practices of devotion, from chanting to his Gayatri, to his offering of food, to being regulated. And so I was thinking about, there was this saying I heard many years ago that, like, we're all like oranges, and that when you squeeze us, what's inside comes out. And I was looking it up, it's actually attributed to Wayne Dyer. So, I mean, whether you think of him as an authority or not, I think it's an interesting concept, which is the idea that when somebody criticizes us or puts pressure on us, and when we have that pressure, when you squeeze us, what comes out is orange juice, right? So whatever is inside, that's what's going to come out. So if I get that pressure and if I'm squeezed, like, what will come out under that pressure? So, if we want to actually purify what's inside, that under pressure, what will come out? Joy, love, acceptance, non-judgment. If we want that, then we have to start with just receiving association, and receiving guidance, and even just following a tradition is very special because it shows a kind of humility and a willingness to submit to someone or something that's bigger than ourselves, right? That it's Dhruva Maharaj was like, okay, you want me to worship this deity? You want me to chant Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya? I will do what you say. And that is that, it's just that seed of that willingness to submit to someone who's ultimately bigger and greater than ourselves. Someone that maybe we don't fully understand, but I'm going to submit to myself, to this person, to this ritual, to this tradition. And that can really transform our hearts. So true religion is about transformation. It's not about being perfect. So that's what's so beautiful about Dhruva Maharaj, is that we're meant to transform our desires and open our hearts. So I have some discussion questions. I can't really copy paste it here, but I can share them with you. And so the first one is, what is a spiritual ritual in your life that you've disconnected from with your mood and your heart? So reflect on why you do this ritual and how it has shaped you over the course of your life. So just, what is a ritual? And just reflect. And then another discussion question is, reflect upon a time in your life when you were empowered to serve. So what was the service and what was your experience of that service? So you can trace back to how the service began, and both in the actual service itself, and what was your mood in starting that service, and what do you notice and what do you wonder about the experience. So thank you so much for your patience with all of this morning. So Hare Krishna.